And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. We often imagine that being interesting is a fixed trait, something we either possess or lack, like a rare mineral lodged in the personality. But the more arresting truth is that interestingness is not a substance but a signal, one we emit only when we've first dared to listen inward. Some people make us feel blank. Others awaken in us entire landscapes of thought, story, and sensation. The difference is rarely in the facts of our lives, but in the conditions they create. In the presence of a particular kind of person, our inner world loosens its grip. The caution that usually governs what we say, what might be too much, too odd, too sad, begins to lift. We surprise ourselves by speaking. They are not necessarily the most accomplished, the most articulate, or the loudest. They are simply the most traversed. To sit with someone who has wandered through their own anxiety, absurdity, grief, and contradiction is to sit with a map that gently permits our own exploration. Not because they instruct us how to travel, but because they do not flinch when we arrive. The truly interesting person is not a curator of facts, but a survivor of feeling. They have gone where most avoid, and in doing so, they radiate an unspoken welcome. Here too, you may speak. So the question is not how to gather better anecdotes, read more books, or become wittier at parties. The question is, how many rooms in ourselves have we opened? And more precisely, which ones have we not? It is in the courage to enter those silent, strange, possibly shameful corridors that we prepare ourselves not just to be heard, but to make others feel heard. The mind that has dialogued with its own sorrow becomes a sanctuary for the sorrows of others. The person who has faced their own strangeness becomes a lighthouse for those adrift in theirs. To become more interesting, then, is to become more honest, not in confession, but in capacity. The more we can hold, the more we can invite. We do not become magnetic by being known, but by being knowable. And that begins when we ask ourselves not what will impress the world, but what have I quietly survived? What have I dared to feel? What is the thing I've never said aloud, even to myself, and what might happen if I do? It is not the sparkle of our opinions or the novelty of our anecdotes that allows us to reach others, but the tone in which we hold them, whether there is room within our ideas for another person's truth to breathe. We misunderstand charisma as projection, as if it depends on how much noise we make. But the truly captivating person is often the one whose presence gives us back to ourselves. They do not rush in to correct, to fix, to fill the silence. They listen with an attention that seems to reach beneath the content of our words, tuning instead to the conditions that allowed those words to form. And in doing so, they subtly author a more generous version of us. Around such people, memory becomes porous. We find ourselves recalling things we didn't know we'd kept. We speak in a voice that surprises us with its depth. We are, in their company, more articulate, more connected, more alive. But the miracle is not that they extract this from us. It's that they permit it. They create the conditions under which it's safe to emerge. And these conditions are rarely strategic. They do not arise from reading body language or memorizing conversational prompts. They come from something deeper and quieter, a life lived in relation to its own difficulty. Someone who has made peace with their contradictions does not need to silence ours. Someone who has spoken honestly to themselves does not require our concealment, and so the encounter becomes mutual. Interestingness, then, is not a quality we impose, but a field we open. It emerges not from performance, but from permission. We give others the chance to become more fully themselves when we are no longer afraid to be fully ourselves. And this, paradoxically, makes us interesting, not because we try to be, but because we've stopped trying to be anything else. We've made a life of asking better questions. We've allowed ourselves to live in ambiguity, to admit confusion, to walk toward what we don't yet understand. That courage to dwell in complexity without rushing to closure is magnetic. Not because it dazzles, but because it relieves. It tells others they are not alone in their strangeness. It tells them they do not need to perform understanding in order to be understood. And that is the kind of presence people remember, not because it entertained them, but because it made them feel seen. If someone feels interesting in our presence, it is often because we have given them back a part of themselves they had quietly exiled. We didn't flatter them or provoke them or dazzle them with questions. We simply held open a space in which their story could unspool without friction. And what made that possible was not technique, but temperament. A temperament shaped by having once needed that space ourselves. The person who becomes a confidant, a catalyst, a co-conspirator in someone else's self-expression is often the one who has already rehearsed their own unspeakable truths. Not performed them, but listened to them privately with something like care. They have spent long, uncelebrated hours noticing the weather patterns of their own interior, how memory moves, how fear lodges, how shame quiets. And because of that, they recognize the contours of those same states in others, without needing them to be packaged or named. In this way, we become, without announcing it, a kind of sanctuary. Not a guru, not a spectacle, but a room in which someone else's deeper voice can safely echo. When we no longer flinch at the mess of being human, we make it easier for others to stop flinching too. That doesn't mean we glamorize pain or wallow in it. It means we stop needing everything to resolve. The mind that has learned to bear its own unresolvedness is a quiet revolution, because it grants others the same dignity, to not be neat, to not be finished, to not be fine. Interestingness in this light is less about charisma than about capacity. How much sorrow can you hold? How much ambiguity? How much humor, absurdity, complexity? Not performatively, but truly, without needing to flatten or contain it. And the strange reward of cultivating this kind of presence is that people will often say, "I've never said that before," or "I don't know why I'm telling you this." It will seem like you've done nothing, but in fact, you've done the hardest thing. You've become someone who doesn't panic at what is real. And this, finally, is the quiet core of what it means to be interesting. Not to be adorned with stories, but to be the kind of person others can bring their stories to. Not to impress, but to invite. Not to shine, but to shelter. To open ourselves in this way is not to become endlessly available or to carry the weight of everyone else's complexity. It is rather to shift the axis of presence from the performance of self to the reception of being. We become more interesting not by acquiring things to say, but by developing a kind of radical receptivity, a felt readiness to receive what is not yet formed in others. This is not passivity. It is not meekness. It is a subtle form of generosity built on the difficult work of self-recognition. When we meet someone who listens without strain, who reflects without judgment, whose attention does not contract in the face of our confusion, we instinctively lean toward them. Our language loosens. We take risks with our sentences. The conversation becomes less a transaction and more a shared emergence, something neither of us could have produced alone. It is here that true interest arises, in the co-creation of meaning, not the presentation of, but that kind of mutuality depends on prior labour. On having spoken many times into our own silence, on having heard our own bitterness, our own joy, our own strange ideas, and stayed with them long enough that they could mature into coherence. If we have not done this, we will not tolerate the same in others. We will interrupt, we will rush, we will tidy, we will unconsciously protect ourselves from their complexity because it reminds us of the parts of ourselves we have not yet faced. To become more interesting, then, is to become more internally expansive, not louder, not more certain, but more able to tolerate contradiction without collapse, to sit with someone's grief without needing to rescue, to encounter strangeness without recoiling, to hold joy without needing to turn it into something useful. Such people are rare. Not because the work is mystical, but because it is inconvenient. It requires time, discomfort, self-suspicion. But when it is done, when someone has truly walked the perimeter of their own psyche, they emit a kind of quiet signal, not "look at me," but "you are safe here." And in that safety, other people bloom. So if you wish to become more interesting, you might begin not with the world, but with yourself. Not by collecting better stories, but by letting the ones you already carry speak. Not by becoming someone others will find impressive, but someone in whose company they feel more fully alive. The path to becoming more interesting, then, is neither linear nor performative. It is intimate, circular, and often unobservable. It asks not for new skills, but for new permissions, the permission to pause, to remain inarticulate, to not yet know. It invites us to trace our attention inward, not for introspection's sake, but to become better listeners of the unspoken in others. The deeper we go, the quieter we become. And in that quietness, something magnetic happens, not because we demand attention, but because we no longer need it. In this state, we become available, not just physically, but emotionally, psychically, relationally. Others begin to notice not just that we hear them, but that we hold them gently, without conclusion. We do not react, we respond. We do not advise, we echo. We do not fill their silence with insight, but protect it as a space where their own might form. This is what it means to host another person's becoming. And that hosting changes us too. The more we make room for others, the more we are surprised by what emerges from them: insights, confessions, confusions, dreams. We realize that the world is not short of interesting people. It is short of the kind of listening that allows them to appear. We mistake silence for emptiness, when often it is only waiting for permission. So we keep clearing space. We keep softening our stance. We learn to trust that what is unresolved in us does not disqualify us from connection. It prepares us for it. When we meet someone else's chaos with steadiness, it is not because we are whole, but because we are practiced in not fleeing. This is the silent training of the interesting person, not in what they know, but in how they stay. They stay with themselves in their darkness and uncertainty, so they can stay with others in theirs. They are not comfortable in every situation, but they are not governed by discomfort. They do not reach for control. They wait, and in that waiting, they become rare. Because rarity now is not about brilliance. It is about presence. It is about being unhurried, unthreatened, and unchanged by the need to impress. In a world of noise, this is radical. It invites a different kind of attention, one that transforms not through performance, but through quiet permission to be fully falteringly human. To live this way is to stop treating the self as a performance and begin treating it as a landscape, something to be explored, dwelled in, returned to. The interesting person is not the one who is always on, but the one who has made a quiet home within the unfamiliar parts of themselves. They've ceased to curate every impression. They no longer monitor their speech for effect. Instead, they speak as one who knows that interest is not something to be achieved, but something to be uncovered, and that uncovering begins within. When we meet someone who has truly made contact with the depth and strangeness of their own psyche, we feel it immediately. It isn't dramatic, it doesn't declare itself, but it invites us unmistakably. These are the people who don't flinch when we say the awkward, who don't rush past the moment we hesitate, who don't fill in the gaps for us, but sit beside them and wait. There is room in their presence for delay, for confusion, for contradiction. And when that room opens, something inside us steps forward. Often a voice we hadn't heard before, or a story we thought had no relevance, or a memory we believed too small or strange to matter. These are not rehearsed moments. They're emergent. They happen because someone has signalled, without saying so, that the unpolished parts of us are welcome. That our lives do not need to be edited into interest, but simply allowed to unfold. The result is subtle, but profound. Around these people, we remember who we are when we're not trying to be anything. We find ourselves funny again, or curious again, or tender in ways we'd forgotten. It is not that they give us these qualities. It is that they no longer block them through expectation, judgment, or haste. Their openness unlocks ours. And it works both ways. The more we hold that kind of space for others, the more it deepens in us. We notice more. We speak less, but with greater care. We become the kind of person whose presence slows time, not because we demand attention, but because we allow reality to arrive unforced. This is the quiet authority of the truly interesting, not a domination of space, but a transformation of it, not a brilliance that outshines, but a gentleness that includes. And in that inclusion, something exquisite happens. Others begin to light up, not in competition, but in recognition. In a culture that rewards immediacy, certainty, and polish, it can feel counterintuitive. perhaps even naive to believe that what makes us most magnetic is our willingness to remain unfinished. But it is precisely this unfinishability, this quiet resistance to spectacle, that allows others to feel seen. We are not interesting because we have figured everything out. We are interesting because we have stopped pretending that we have. This shift is subtle but radical. It asks us to trust the value of what hasn't yet been articulated, to sit inside the half-formed idea, the faltering sentence, the feeling without a name, and to know deeply that these moments matter, that they are not waiting to be corrected or completed, but to be heard. When we become people who can tolerate that kind of ambiguity, we become rare. Not because we are mysterious, but because we are safe, not because we hold answers, but because we hold space. This is what others sense, not a glittering persona, but a deep interior permission. Around us, they find themselves unhurried, their minds wander safely, their memories surface unbidden. They begin to speak in ways that surprise even them. And if we are paying attention, we will see it. The slight drop in their shoulders, the way their voice deepens, the pause they take before choosing a word more carefully. These are the moments where true connection occurs. Not in the brilliant turn of phrase, but in the unseen shift from guardedness to presence. To create that shift, we must have already made it in ourselves. We must know what it feels like to stop performing long enough to notice what remains. We must have encountered the parts of ourselves that aren't tidy or appealing or ready for company, and we must have learned not to exile them. That is the real preparation, not how we dress, speak or posture, but how we relate to the unspoken within. And so the path forward is not about adding more. It is about subtracting what stands between us and honesty. We become more interesting not by becoming more impressive, but by becoming more whole. Not by amplifying our voices, but by clearing the noise around them. Not by trying to matter, but by noticing that we already do. When we show up unarmored, unpolished, and attentive. This is the kind of presence that lingers, not as performance, but as proof that in a world obsessed with surfaces, depth is still felt. There is a kind of grace in someone who no longer needs to steer the moment. They are not detached, but unhooked from the need to be right, to be dazzling, to be in control. They have moved past the performance of personality into something quieter and more generous, accompaniment. To be with them is to feel as though something is gently being lifted, not because they take our burdens, but because they remind us that they don't need to be hidden. We often think that being interesting requires novelty, but it may be that what truly holds others is familiarity, not the familiarity of cliché, but of recognition. When someone speaks with emotional accuracy about something we thought was ours alone, shame, absurdity, loneliness, we lean closer, not because we are intrigued, but because we are relieved. And this is where the interesting person distinguishes themselves, not in how much they say, but in what they allow others to say. Their presence is not a spotlight, but a field, not a stage, but a clearing. Around them, people feel less like performers and more like people. And in that subtle shift, conversations change. We are no longer trading cleverness, we are exchanging something else, the feeling of being known. This is not to say that charm, humour or intellect are without value. But without this underlying permission, this foundational welcome, they remain exterior. We may be entertained, but we will not be moved. And to be truly interesting is to move something, to alter the internal landscape of another, even slightly. That ability is not taught, it is cultivated through years of listening inwardly, of noticing when we braced against discomfort, of learning to soften without fleeing. It is in these moments, alone, unremarkable, sometimes even unnoticed, that the real work is done. And over time, this work becomes a kind of atmosphere, not visible, not branded, but felt. Others feel steadier near us, not because we have solved their problems, because we do not treat them as problems to be solved. We've abandoned the impulse to fix and replaced it with the discipline of presence. This is the unseen architecture of the interesting life, not built from spectacle, but from attention. Not drawn from performance, but from participation. And it is marked by a single, quiet trait, the ability to make others feel more real in our presence. That is the invitation, that is the gift, and that, in the end, is what makes us unforgettable. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.